A few years ago, some rabbis counted the verses in the Bible. When they came to the 5,708th verse of the Bible, they took note that it was a prophecy which came to pass in the Jewish calendar year 5,708. Could the verses then of the Bible be year verses? When they came to Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 5, the 5,708th verse of the Masoretic text, they read these words, "And the Lord thy God will bring thee into the land which thy fathers possessed, and thou shalt possess it." The year 5708 corresponds to our calendar year 1948. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me this second installment of our program, the year verses of the Torah.
The Torah, the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible. And in fact, I'm holding here a Hebrew or Masoretic text, and it is verse numbered, by the way, J.R., which has come to be the convention in our time. The Masoretic text, however, is the standard Hebrew text. And if you simply count the verses, starting in Genesis, going through the end of Deuteronomy, by the time you come to the 30th chapter of Deuteronomy, for example, you're in the 5,704th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th verses. And so you just count consecutively. And the thought among some rabbis today is that this is the Hebrew calendar date. For example, 5708 corresponding to the Gentile date, 1948. And as we have discussed before, this has led us to look in other places, because if we have 1948 talking about possessing the land, this being the very year of Jewish statehood, then maybe the correlation would apply elsewhere as well.
Yes. On our last program, we went back to the early part of this century, to 1915, and began to look at chapter 29 of Deuteronomy and verse 1, which would be, if this concept holds true, the verse for 1915. Well, on today's program, we're going to move into the future now and talk about the verses after the 5,708th verse. We also dealt with the verse which would be for 1967, Gary, in chapter 31, verse 4. And it does speak of a war, and it speaks of the same kind of thing that happened in the 1967 Six-Day War.
Yeah, it really does. As you look at these verse correlations, you find the verses roughly coinciding with what happened to Israel in the modern era. By the way, this restates a prophetic idea. That is, there is an interpretive idea that you have prophetic themes in the Old Testament which are played out once, and sometimes again, and sometimes a third time as you reach the latter days. And we find in the 1967 verse, which would be Deuteronomy 31:4, and the Lord shall do unto them, that is the enemies of Israel, as he did to Sihon and to Og, the kings of the Amorites, and unto the land of them whom he destroyed. So when the Israelites came into the land, Moses led the armies of Israel, destroying the tribes of giants who had the lands just east of the Jordan River. Well, this was significant in that it cleared the way for entry into the land. Well, in 1967, J.R., there was another war, equally significant, that cleared the way for the entry into the land. In fact, the Temple Mount was taken in 1967.
Yes, now, the reason why we are even considering the possibility that this could be prophetic in its makeup here is that these chapters in Deuteronomy move from the Palestinian covenant through to the Song of Moses. And it's kind of interesting that Flavius Josephus talked about the Song of Moses and that it was a prophecy. So if we are looking at this prophetic structure around the Song of Moses, indeed, this may be the time in which all of this will take place. Tell us what Josephus said, Gary, about Moses' song.
In a moment, I'm going to do that, but let me preface by referring to the Song of Moses in this way. As you look at the 31st chapter of Deuteronomy, which just precedes the Song of Moses, the Lord tells Moses to write the song. In Deuteronomy 31:19, he says, "Now therefore write ye this song for you, teach it to the children of Israel." Deuteronomy 31:21, "And it shall come to pass that when many evils and troubles are befallen them, that this song shall testify against them for a witness." And here we have Deuteronomy 31:22. "Moses therefore wrote this song the same day and taught it to the children of Israel." And finally, in verse 30, the last verse of chapter 31, "Moses spake in the ears of all the congregation of Israel the words of this song until they were ended." The song is very important in the sight of the Lord. Well, Josephus, first century historian of the Jews, refers to the Song of Moses, and I quote, "After this, he read to them a poetic song, which was composed in hexameter verse, and left it to them in the holy book. It contained a prediction of what was to come to pass afterward." And that couldn't be
a prophecy.
It's a prophecy. In fact, in the days of the first century, it was recognized to be a prophecy.
In fact, Josephus goes on to say that it was in the under fulfillment even in his day.
That's right. As a matter of fact, continuing with Josephus, "Agreeably whereto all things have happened all along and do still happen to us, and wherein he has not at all deviated from the truth." End quote.
In other words, Josephus believed that this song was literally coming to pass in his day. And it was, because the Song of Moses says that God is going to turn from the Jews to the Gentiles, and that he's going to drive them from their land and scatter them among the nations of the world. Well, think now, Josephus wrote at the end of the first century, just a few years after the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem and burned Herod's temple to the ground. The Jews were certainly being scattered to the slave markets of the world during that time. And of course, Josephus himself was a slave. Though he was well taken care of, he was still considered a servant or slave in the home of the Caesar of Rome. And so we've got this fascinating prophecy here called the Song of Moses. And these verses are numbered according to something that would take place in the far future from the days of Moses, our very day in which we now live. If the 5,708th verse was 1948, and if this verse 4, Gary, of chapter 31 speaks of the Six-Day War, then we would come down to verses 9 and 10, which would speak of the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and the Jewish eyes turning toward the Temple Mount. And you know, the flavor of these verses are toward restoration of temple worship and spiritual revival among the Jews.
Yeah, they really are. As you approach the giving of the Song of Moses, the verses immediately preceding that all speak of God's charge to Israel, reminding them of the presence of the Lord in the Holy Tabernacle, reminding them of the Ark, reminding them that if they were not obedient, he would hide his face. And J.R., the verse that I think is especially meaningful is the 29th verse of Deuteronomy 31, where Moses says to the children of Israel, "For I know that after my death you will utterly corrupt yourselves and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands." And as we have discussed several times before, this term latter days, the Hebrew ba'akarit hayomim, means in the latter end of days, or at the very last days. And I think these are the days just prior to the coming of the kingdom of the Lord.
Fascinating. Can you imagine this is a prophecy of these days in which we now live? In 1991, we published the book Hidden Prophecies in the Song of Moses. And little did I know at that time that Moses published his song in verse 28, as he says, "Gather unto me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I may speak these words in their ears." That would be the verse, according to this concept of the rabbis, for 1991. And we published this book in 1991. So it's almost as if God, through Moses, was saying, this book is going to be published in the year numbered according to that verse.
At the very least, it's one of those amazing coincidences.
Yes.
And of course, for the Christian, there are no coincidences. God has everything laid out.
Yeah, now let's get into this Song of Moses here,
Okay.
because we're at 1995 here, and
Right.
the Song of Moses begins with a verse that would correspond with 1994.
Right, and let me just review now the 29th verse of Deuteronomy 31, where the latter days are spoken of, corresponds to 1992. The 30th verse of Deuteronomy 31 would correspond then to 1993, using this reckoning. And then the first verse of chapter 32, where the Song of Moses begins, would correspond to the Jewish year 5754 or 1994. Give ear, O ye heavens, and I will speak, and hear, O earth, the words of my mouth. Then verse 2 is the 5755th verse, corresponding to the year 1995, which says, My doctrine shall drop as the rain, my speech shall distill as the dew, as the small rain upon the tender herb, and as the showers upon the grass. Beautiful song, beautiful sentiment in this verse of the Song of Moses.
Is it possible that we are now in the Song of Moses years? Is it possible that these latter years, or latter days he's referring to here, are the years ending this century, and we have now entered into this Song of Moses? If so, then the first 7 verses of this Song of Moses would deal with these years from 1994 to the year 2000. And it's kind of interesting, Gary, that Psalm 95 deals with this same kind of theme.
It does, J.R.
Because here he says, my speech. And Psalm 95 says, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your heart, as in the provocation. He goes on to say, 40 years I was grieved with these people. Well, here they are now at the end of the 40 years, and God in Psalm 95 seems to be referencing back to that and into the far future to 1995.
Now, you know, when someone says, today, if you'll hear my voice, this is like, listen up, pay attention. Now, this is talking about, or almost marking a starting point, if you can see it that way.
Yes.
Today, if you'll hear my voice, listen, open your heart. Do not harden your heart like the children of Israel did so long ago when they came out of Egypt. And they were forced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. In other words, it's as though, could we say, another Exodus is getting ready to take place, another signal event in the life of Israel.
Another kingdom. They're right on the borders of the kingdom, as they were here in Deuteronomy 32, right on the border of the kingdom. And Joshua would take them, Yehoshua,
Right.
the same basic root name from which we get the word Jesus, Joshua. And Jesus is the greater Joshua. And he is ready to take them into the promised land. And Moses sings this song, and it appears to be a prophecy of the far future, just as Josephus said.
Absolutely.
And we've got here in verse 3, because I will publish the name of the Lord, ascribe ye greatness unto our God. That would be for 1996, would it, Gary?
You know, J.R., that is the 5756th verse, corresponding to 1996. I will publish the name of the Lord. This idea of publication, if you will, is like a declaration, a public declaration. It's like the idea of standing up and shouting from the rooftops. Listen, you people, God's getting ready to do something. Declare the glory of God. And curiously, we find that same phrase or that same idea in Psalm 96.
Yes. David used Psalm 96 on the day when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into the Tabernacle of David. And Psalm 96 has some fascinating things to say. Listen, for example, as he says, declare his glory among the Gentiles. Verse 3.
Wow.
And in verse 8, give unto the Lord the glory due his name, bring an offering and come into his courts. And so, Gary, this idea of publishing the name of the Lord, ascribe ye greatness unto our God, sounds like the restoration of temple worship. In fact, this very next verse here in the Song of Moses says, he is the rock. Well, now there are 2 rocks on the mountain There's the rock that lies under the dome of the rock, the Muslim mosque. But there's another rock that lies just to the north of that, the high point of the mountain, thought to be by some archaeologists the foundation stone for the Ark of the Covenant. What a rock, Gary.
And by the way, the foundation stone for the Ark of the Covenant, the whole thing is a picture of our rock, the rock upon whom rests our faith, the Lord Jesus Christ. We have the rock here in verse 4 of Deuteronomy 32 capitalized. The translators of the King James Bible thought it was fit to capitalize rock as a proper noun because it's obviously talking about Jesus.
Talking about the Messiah. Yeah.
And J.R., the Song of Moses then it clearly identifies itself as speaking of Messianic times.
Yes.
Purely.
Yes. This rock, of course, is the rock referred to in Psalm 95, the rock that Moses had to die because he smote twice.
Yeah.
This is the rock out of which the water came. Gary, do you remember Ezekiel came to the Temple Mount and he stood in ankle-deep water coming out of that rock?
Mm-hmm. I do.
And he went out a little ways. He was in waist-deep water. Mm-hmm. And so from the mountain, in fact, it's Zechariah who says, "In that day I will open a fountain," I guess on the Temple Mount.
And the waters of creation will pour forth.
Yeah. You know, it's kind of interesting that a few years ago the rabbis came down to the into that little tunnel that is built along the bedrock, right along the western wall, and they opened the door to their little cabinet where they keep their Torah scrolls, and to their horror they found those Torah scrolls were wet. And they said, the Arabs, they've poured water down this wall in order to make our materials wet. Well, on the other side of that wall was a Muslim library, and their books were wet.
And the end of the story is that there's a source of water there that nobody knew anything about.
That's rising up underneath that Temple Mount.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible? And so we have here the rock out of which the water came. And then, we don't know that that's going to be 1997, but it is kind of interesting, the flavor, the gist of the story.
As a matter of fact, what we're looking at is a trend. We're not trying to predict the future. We're not trying to be soothsayers here, and we're not trying to name dates, but we do believe that there's ample evidence here that shows us trends. And the Bible has a word for trends, or a term for trends, and that term is times and seasons. We are to be constantly attempting to discern the times and seasons. That's what we're doing now.
Well, you know, this fascinating thing about these, look at verse 7, Gary. This would be the one for the year 2000.
Yeah.
If this idea of the rabbis follows through. And of course, this being a prophetic portion, has at least some weight of evidence that it may indeed be. When we get to verse 7, we've got an incredible verse here.
Yeah, and by the way, verse 7 is the 5,760th verse of the Torah, corresponding to the year 2000. Read that.
Yeah. Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Now I went to a 13th century Jewish commentary to find out what this verse said to the rabbis. And they said, this remember the days of old were the 6 days of creation. And considering the years of many generations would be the years that those 6 days of creation prophetically represented, namely the 6,000 years. Now here we are in the year 2000, at the end of 6,000 years, at the end of 6 days, and the verse says, remember those 6 days of creation? Do you remember those preceding 6 millennia? Well, remember those, because they are important. Ask thy father, he will show thee. The elders, they will tell thee. Remember, remember, remember the days of old, and consider the years of many generations. Gary, that's an incredible verse for the year 2000.
Yeah, consider Now, that means think about it.
Yeah.
And JR, when you start thinking about it, you think, well, let's look at that. If that's true, we're starting a new millennium, starting in 2001. And as you look then at verses 8 through 14, the next 7 verses, again you see a trend. And the trend you see has to do with the types, the figures, the symbols that we all think of as tribulational in nature.
Gary, that means this Song of Moses is so important. And when we come to the last chapters of Revelation, we are reminded that this Song of Moses is a prophecy.
In fact, it is a prophecy, and its words will never be forgotten. They're engraved in the halls of heaven. And one day, looking back on all these verses, we'll be able to see that they were an indicator of the times and seasons, which at present we only dimly grasp. But we're trying to relate to you that we can see some view of what's happening.
Since these days are so important, being the days of the fulfillment of the Song of Moses, I would urge you to make sure of your soul. Trust in the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal Savior. Pray a simple sinner's prayer. Tell Him you know you're a sinner and you're sorry. Ask Him to forgive you and save you. He will. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.